In my last three keynote addresses, I've told you about what I thought were the cutting-edge developments in positive psychology, and I'm going to talk about two of them today. The first one of which I think is quite revolutionary, and it will be a little bit technical, and I'm going to take you back 50 years to rats and learned helplessness, and you'll see why in a moment. So this is basically a set of major discoveries by Steve Mayer that I wanted to tell you about. So let me remind you where I came from in the long history of positive psychology. So 50 years ago, we were interested in the difference between events that animals and people could control and exactly the same event uncontrollably. So the paradigm I'm going to talk about for the next 15 minutes, let me see if learned helplessness consists of two different situations. In the first, and I'm going to talk about rats for the next 10 minutes, rats get either, in a wheel turning situation, escapable shock that they can turn off by turning the wheel, exactly the same shock, inescapably, or no shock. And then later on, they're taken to a brand new situation, a shuttle box, in which all they have to do is run across a barrier to turn off the shock. And what we consistently found, and now hundreds of studies on this, was that if you had inescapable shock, you essentially gave up and lay there and didn't do anything, 2/3 of the animals. If you had exactly the same shock, but you could control it by wheel turning, you escape just fine. And then there's always a control group which gets no shock, and they escape just fine. And the theory that we put forward that the field accepted, which turns out to be completely wrong, and wrong for reasons that will be very interesting for positive psychology, was we said that during the inescapable shock, the rats essentially learned that nothing they did mattered, that anything they did was independent of shock going off. And having learned that nothing they did matter, expecting that nothing they did matter, when they went to the new situation, they would expect shock, nothing they can do, and they don't try to escape. That turns out to be 180 degrees wrong. And this is due to the last 15 years of research that Steve Mayer has done on the brains of rats in these situations. So let me take you through it and tell you why I think it's so important for positive psychology. In the center of this diagram, I hope I can get this to work, no, I can't, is the DRN. That turns out to be a structure deep in the brain called the dorsal raphe nucleus. And when that's activated, about 30,000 cells, it turns out it produces passivity. It produces excess fear, the two things on the right. And it's going to turn out, to our amazement, that the activation of the dorsal raphe nucleus is necessary and sufficient for learned helplessness, and that giving up and becoming passive is the default mammalian reaction to bad events, whether or not they're controllable. I'll say that again, this is very important. The default reaction of us and rats to bad events, whether or not we can control them, is to collapse and to give up. Now that turns out to be quite important, and let me go through the evidence for it, and then I'll go through the evidence that's related to positive psychology, basic stuff. So if you give rats inescapable shock, but you turn off the DRN, they're not helpless later on, okay? Part one. Part two, if you let the DRN operate during inescapable shock, but you block serotonin, 5-HT, which is the relevant neurotransmitter, there's no helplessness. If you activate the DRN with nothing else going on, no inescapable shock, then you get passivity and giving up. So blocking the dorsal raphe nucleus, blocking serotonin in the dorsal raphe nucleus, and you can do it very specifically, even during inescapable shock, means there's no helplessness, and it shows that the dorsal raphe nucleus is a necessary condition of learned helplessness. It's also a sufficient condition of learned helplessness. It's a rare event when you find a brain center that is both necessary and sufficient for a behavioral phenomenon. So one of the few instances of this I know. And for sufficiency, if you activate the dorsal raphe nucleus, no inescapable shock, nothing, the animals are passive and give up. And here's the really dramatic stuff that Steve did. So you go back to the original paradigm and you give either inescapable shock or escapable shock. And at the beginning, both inescapable and escapable shock activate the dorsal raphe nucleus. So it turns on, but during escape, when the animals learn in the first few trials there's something they can do, the dorsal raphe turns off. It keeps going with inescapable shock, but it turns off with escapable shock. If you measure the neurons, the serotonin neurons that go to the part that produces passivity, it turns out they're sensitized. And they're sensitized for about 3 to 5 days. And that turns out to be the same as the time course of what the effect of inescapable shock on passivity. Those of you who are scholars of this may remember that learned helplessness dissipates in time, and we could never explain why. Well, it turns out it's the neurons that are sensitized for that period of time, and that's when it occurs. And then the dramatic stuff that Steve then did was to ask the question, how does the dorsal raphe nucleus find out that something is escapable or inescapable? It's too few cells to do anything cognitive. It's 30,000 cells. It's not possible. And so Steve started to measure, well, is there some structure earlier in the brain up here that excites the dorsal raphe, which would say, oh, things are inescapable, turn off. And it turns out there is no structure that does that. Nothing that goes to the dorsal raphe nucleus excites it. And that leaves only one possibility, that there's something that turns it off. There's something that inhibited it. And here's what Steve then did. He looked in the ventral medial prefrontal cortex in rats, and he mapped out the pathways, and he found out that the ventral medial prefrontal cortex selectively inhibits the dorsal raphe nucleus. So he's got the structure that turns off the dorsal raphe nucleus. What's going on in the prefrontal cortex detects that things are escapable, and that inhibits the dorsal raphe and turns off helplessness. And it turns out this structure, the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, and again, we're going to do necessity and sufficiency here, very elegant stuff, is necessary for escapable shock to inhibit the dorsal raphe nucleus. And here's how we did it. So remember, you've got rats learning to escape by wheel turning. So he lets them do that, but at the same time as they're learning to escape, he turns off the ventral medial prefrontal cortex. So they're learning perfectly well to escape, but he blocks the transmission to the dorsal raphe nucleus, and they're not helpless. I'm sorry. So later on in the shuttle box, they do perfectly well, even though they got even though the rats learned to escape well, they're helpless later in the shuttle box. So they escape well, but the transmission to the dorsal raphe is blocked, and they're helpless. So somehow the fact that they could escape things doesn't get transmitted from the front part of the brain to the passivity center. Then he did the reverse. He turned on the ventral medial prefrontal cortex with no escapable or inescapable shock. It blocks the dorsal raphe nucleus, and it prevents helplessness from occurring, even if shock is inescapable. So the conclusion of all of this is that there are two circuits, one of which is extremely important for this audience. I'll try to explain why in a moment. There's a circuit that goes from the ventral medial prefrontal cortex to the dorsal medial striatum. That detects that you have control. And then there's another circuit, crucial, which we're going to call the hope circuit. That's the circuit that goes from the ventral medial prefrontal cortex to the dorsal raphe nucleus, and it carries the expectation that things will be controllable in the future. So this is essentially what Steve has shown. So this means that helplessness is not learned. It's the default reaction, and that what we have and what rats have is a circuit that can override this default reaction and block helplessness. Now, why have I spent 15 minutes telling this audience about this research? I think this turns therapy, education completely on its head. So as a psychotherapist, what I learned and what I did in cognitive therapy and behavior therapy is you want to undo learned helplessness. That is, you want to work on people's catastrophic thoughts that they're helpless. This says that's a waste of time. That alleviating catastrophe is not vouchsafed for us to do it. We essentially can't do it. But what we can do is build expectations of control, build expectations of mastery. Now that says two crucial things for the future of positive psychology. That we've been on the right track. That is, by building what is positive, what we're doing is what's possible, what's vouchsafed to us to do. That is, we're building the hope circuit. And by thinking about prospection, the ways in which people plan for the future and expect the future, we're building the hope circuit. So in some ways, Steve's research tells us that the locus of effect of positive psychology is this circuit. And since no one has found out how to use this circuit in human beings, it may be that transmagnetic cortical stimulation will do that in the future. The way to do it is the way we do it, by building expectations of mastery and control. So it turns out there's a justification for positive psychology that I never saw coming, that Steve's work has revealed. It says that you all are right in the center of a radical reformulation of education and psychotherapy. Don't undo the bad stuff, build the good stuff. That's all we have. So that's one discovery I wanted to tell you about and extrapolate from. So I'm sort of nervous talking to you. I've never given this talk before. This is the first time I've talked in public. So Steve, learned helplessness was discovered exactly 50 years ago. So Steve and I are just trying to write this up, an article called Learned Helplessness Unraveled 50 years later. So you're the first people we've talked about it to. So the other thing that I'm excited about is the World Wellbeing Project. This began about 5 years ago when I lectured to Google Zeitgeist, and I got together with the Google Earth people, and I said, I think we can measure instantaneously the well-being of the world in real time. And since then, this group led by Johannes, Andy, and Lyle has been slaving away on this. And there's all sorts of new stuff that makes me think we're on the verge of having the equivalent of a Dow Jones average for well-being. That is, there is a way of minute by minute, hour by hour, for every major city and country in the world, quantifying with some validity well-being. Now, it's not going to be done by questionnaire, and part of this is a reaction to questionnaire. So Hector, if I ask you, how are you feeling today? How happy are you? You can get answers to that, but they're rather unreliable. People lie, people try to please you. It's very reactive, and it's very expensive to do questionnaires, and you can only do them on a few people. But the social media change all that, because it turns out that if you take the formulation of well-being that I like, PERMA, that the five domains of well-being are positive emotion, engagement, relationships, meaning, and accomplishment. It turns out there are between 50 and 100,000 words in English. And we're also doing this now in Spanish, German, and Chinese, and we hope to be doing it for every major language. But importantly, there is a very large dictionary of positive emotion words and their opposite, negative emotion words, engagement, excited versus bored, relationships, good versus bad, meaning and accomplishment. And what the social media do is they provide this enormous database for combing through what's being said, looking for those 100,000 words and quantifying the deployment of those words. And that, in an unobtrusive and non-reactive way, gives you a measure of PERMA. And you can localize it down to zip code level if you have enough Twitter and Facebook, which we do. So let me tell you the sort of thing that we find. Positive emotion words. Now, even though these are cute word cloud slides, these are statistical as well. The bigger the word, the more it distinguishes, in this case, positive emotion statistically from negative emotion. These are enormously statistically significant, and they're very well corrected for chance. So people who have high positive emotion say amazing, love, happy, wonderful. People who have high negative emotions say tired of, sick, fuck, hate, sad. And so it means you can comb through either individual or group Twitter or Facebook and make predictions about positive and negative emotion. For relationships, again, people in good relationships, birthday, love, happy, friends. People who have bad relationships, hate, people, fake, bitch, and the like. So you're able, and this is for people with high meaning and low meaning, and again, these are always based on 10,000 or more statuses. God, Jesus, thank, Lord, and people with low meaning in life feel like, broken, why, tired. So what's being shown here is that there is a new way of assessing PERMA in individuals, in groups, in countries, and the like. Life satisfaction. How about people who are highly satisfied with life? This is based on 300,000, and the ends are enormous here. Now, too technical to go through, but you can statistically organize words into topics. And that's not done a priori, it's done mechanically. And so people who have high satisfaction with life have pumped up, excited, tomorrow, great lunch, wonderful family, council, meetings, students, Zumba, yoga, and the like. And again, the bigger the word, the more that distinguishes them from people who have low life satisfaction. People who have low life satisfaction, if you look at the parallel groups, bored, boredom, bore, liars, guts, computers, crappy, sick, feeling, wanna, lonely, touch. So this tells you there are non-questionnaire ways of, and I'm not showing, but you can do the same thing for gender, for age, and for satisfaction with life. Among many interesting findings here, but we're quite interested in the small I and the big we. People who are highly satisfied with life use the word we a great deal and the word I not very much. People who are dissatisfied with life use I a lot and we very little. Many of you are interested in whole communities. So we asked the question for communities, what characterizes a community with high life satisfaction and a community with low life satisfaction? So the way we did this is we took 1,300 counties in the United States and almost 150 million tweets, so the ends are enormous here, and we're able for each county to create a word cloud. And we're able then to divide the word clouds by high life satisfaction and low life satisfaction. And what we use is the CDC life satisfaction indices. Communities that have high life satisfaction, the kids are using words like amazing, fantastic, absolutely, recommend, joy, and bring. And physical activities, camping, lake, trip, class, training, workout. They have goal pursuits, motivation, inspired possibilities. If you have a community with low life satisfaction, you've got the opposite. Sleepy, tired, bored, damn, blech, sucks, ugh. For interpersonal, you see a lot of interpersonal tensions. Hate, stupid, grr, ugh, freaking, and the like. So it turns out that you can predict on a statistical basis for a community from the words that are used what the life satisfaction is. Now you might think, oh, that's just a symptom. So that's as far as I want to go. These are symptoms of life satisfaction. But what psychology has always wanted to do and got diverted from after about 1920 was to know what goes through the heads of people. We're back to it. We're back to what goes through the heads of people. So could it be that using those words themselves is not just a symptom of high life satisfaction, it's what causes high life satisfaction. And if you change the words that people use in their life, as we find here, could you change life satisfaction? I'm not talking this time about the heart attack data, but the same thing is true of cardiac mortality that I just showed you about life satisfaction. And the final thing that I want to mention, and it goes back to Steve Mayer's work, as some of you know, I'm quite interested in prospection. That is the way we look into the future. And psychology got into the mess of the past and the present. And remember what I said with Steve's work, that it's not the past and the present that matters here. What the Hope Circuit is about, it's about control and it's about the future. So the question of changing people's orientation from past and present to future becomes quite important in this. So we're very interested in where do you live? Where do different people live in the past, the present, or the future? And the very same logic holds, that is, past, present, and future have lexicons. There are probably 10,000 words and phrases which tell you in a given sentence whether or not you're in the past, present, or future. And we find something quite remarkable here about aging. So if you look at people between 13 and 20, they're living in the present. That their Facebook, and this is based on 500,000 Facebook statuses, which poll for the present, by the way, they're living in the present, and there's not much about the past and about the future. And as we age, living in the present goes down until you get to age 60, in which very little is about the present, and what increases is the past and the future. Now, if this intrigues you, one of the things we've tried to do is to set this up in a way that all of you can do it with your clients, with your community, and the like. So we've created a website called LexHub, in which we essentially teach you how to take Facebook, tweets, Gmail, etc., and analyze it for virtually any kind of psychological concept you want to analyze. So it's not just PERMA, past, present, and future, but if you're interested in neurosis, alcoholism, trust, these are all amenable. It's the same technique. It's the Templeton Religion Trust that supported all of this, and I want to express my gratitude to them. So in closing, here's what I wanted to say about the future. Positive psychology caught on. I mean, I'm amazed to see 1,200 people from 50 countries here doing it. But every indicator we have of positive psychology, courses taught, grant support, people doing applications of it in education, in the clinic, in industry, that's all going up like this. But what I've tried to talk about today is that in order for positive psychology to flourish, it has to be led by new scientific discoveries. And so it's been my privilege today to tell you the 2 sets of new scientific discoveries that I hope will lead the way for us. Thank you.